Episode 1 of Rings of Power starts the most expensive TV show ever created, with narration from Galadriel, telling us that the world was so young there's been no sunrise, but even then, there was light. Get ready for this sort of cryptic, half-riddled chatter, as we'll be seeing a lot of it in this season. Anyway, the opening scene shows a young Galadriel making a paper boat and watching it sail down the water. There's no killer clowns or drain shenanigans here, don't worry, as the other kids instead throw stones at it. Galadriel's brother, Finrod, shows up and eventually takes her back home after explaining to Galadriel why rocks sink and boats float. Apparently it's to do with where they're looking and not buoyancy. This tiny prologue paves way for a much larger, expansive history, in which Galadriel informs us of the events leading up to right now, including travelling across to Middle-earth. A war lasted centuries and left Middle-earth ravaged. The evil Morgoth was eventually defeated, but his orc spread across the world. In his wake, Sauron stepped up. Unfortunately, Sauron killed Galadriel's brother, leaving his mark on her. Galadriel took up his knife and decided to hunt the evil foe, but his trail ran cold. At the northernmost waste, the company Galadriel runs with have their doubts. It's been years since they've seen an orc and they aren't even sure if they're there anymore. Galadriel ignores a concerned elf, deciding to press ahead despite her companion struggling. In fact, at one point, she's prepared to let her own people die in a search for Sauron. Charming. Thankfully though, they actually stop right in front of Sauron's stronghold. "This place is so evil, our torches give off no warmth," Galadriel says. With her company, they find evidence of dark sorcery and Sauron's mark carved in the stone. Galadriel sees this as a sign of Sauron's presence, but Thondir is far more level-headed, pointing out that they should feed this back to the High King at once. Besides, the mark looks to be years old. Galadriel refuses though, deciding to root out all evil before returning home, even if that means sacrificing everyone in her group. This is the protagonist of the story, by the way. She finds a snow troll hiding in the depths, and thankfully the power of anti-gravity, and being a Mary Sue, sees Galadriel single-handedly take out the snow troll, effortlessly, in less than 3 seconds, after launching herself about 4 meters in the air. Although the others are worried, believing they never should have gone on, Galadriel demands they continue and march at first light. Thondir draws his sword and refuses to follow her, which is fair enough to be honest, and the others agree. We then get our first look at the not hobbits, their ancestors, the Harfoots. They're a resourceful group, and our protagonist in his rabble of halflings is Nori, who rebels from the others and decides to go off exploring. However, she finds an ominous footprint that seems to belong to an orc. Nori's mother is quick to point out that they're set in their ways and shouldn't go off exploring, it's just not in their nature. This race are safe and keep to themselves, which is how they've survived for so long. It's a brief moment we spend with them though, as we then cut across to Elrond at Lindon. He's not allowed to attend the latest meeting, but certainly perks up when he notices Galadriel has returned. She's only just arrived, but she's there to ask the king for fresh supplies in order to head off again on her search for Sauron. Elrond wants her to stick around, but she refuses. Dressed in her armour, Galadriel's not happy to receive a crown as High King Gil-galad informs the company that evil has gone from the world. For their heroic deeds, the group have also been granted passage across the undying lands of Valinor. Everyone breaks into applause, but of course Galadriel's not happy. She rejects the gift and decides to destroy Sauron instead. She even decides to go alone, if need be. Elrond tries to remind her that she's going based on a hunch and could be leading elves to their death. Galadriel doesn't care though. This is, again, just to remind you, the protagonist of our story, and even Elrond's plea of putting up her sword so she can be his friend doesn't deter her, at least to begin with anyway. Eventually she succumbs and heads across on the ship all the same. The other elves begin singing beautifully ethereal lyrics, but for Galadriel she refuses to join in, turning back towards her knife, which happens to be on the floor. Over in the Southlands we get our first look at the forbidden romance between human and elf. That comes in the form of Arondir and Bronwyn. The pair share some nice moments before Medhor is quick to show and remind Arondir there's only been a few pairings in history of men and elf. When orders come in that the High King has declared an end to the Watch, Arondir decides to head back to the village and see Bronwyn. However, there are problems with her cow, which seems to be oozing out disgusting black sludge from its udders. Bronwyn and Arondir decide to travel together east to the village of Hordern, determined to find out what's really going on. Meanwhile, back with the Harfoots, Sadok is convinced that there's something strange going on, and he proves to be right. An asteroid flies across the sky, which all of our main characters see. As for Galadriel, she decides to swim back across the sea alone. Who knows how many miles this sea is, but she's on her own now and already shown how proficient she is with her strength. So I guess she's just going to swim for miles and miles and miles and miles. Just to put this into perspective, by the way, the distance that we're talking about here is more than the Pacific Ocean, so it's pretty stupid. Most expensive show of all time, by the way. As the episode closes out, Nori is the first to the scene, where it's revealed that the asteroid is not just a rock, it appears to hold an elderly guy. And who else is betting this is actually Gandalf? Episode 2 of Rings of Power picks up with Galadriel in the middle of the sea, all alone and swimming back to shore. Again, just to remind you, this is many hundreds of miles that she's swimming back, but who knows, she's going to keep on swimming all the same. Meanwhile, Poppy catches up with Nori, who tumbles into the flaming ruins of the comet. Nori and Poppy decide to take this stranger back to their village, despite warnings not to. Nori believes that this person is important and sees this as fate to be the one to look after him. Bronwyn and Arondir meanwhile search through the ruins of Herdern. Arondir finds a big hole in the ground and decides to go down and search deeper. "I must follow the passage," Arondir says. "You don't know what's down there," Bronwyn replies. "That is the reason I must go." Honestly, the dialogue in this show is atrocious. And with that, he dives down into the tunnels and presses on, determined to find out what's inside. Over in Eregion, the realm of the Elven Smiths, Elrond looks over Fëanor's hammer, a tool that's both beautiful and painful. Celebrimbor wants to build a forge more powerful than any ever built, but Gil-galad isn't offering a great workforce and has sent Elrond instead. Well, Elrond suggests bringing in dwarves from Khazad-dûm to help out. Their prince, Durin, is an old friend for Elrond, and he believes an alliance would be the diplomatic achievement of the age. The pair walk together to the front door, but despite a promise of ram's horns and a warm greeting, Durin is told to leave with a swift no. However, Elrond invokes the right of Sigyn Tarag, which allows him entry. He's led inside alone, promising Celebrimbor that he'll be back in a few days after working his magic. It turns out the Sigyn Tarag is actually a rite of endurance. He and Durin need to bash a rock constantly until one of them gives up. Durin breaks his rock with ease, as does Elrond, and this repeats for quite some time until Elrond eventually fails. Durin escorts him to the exit though. Durin is not happy given Elrond has missed his wedding and his kids growing up. Off the back of this, Durin changes his mind, especially when Elrond congratulates him. He's not going to be banished after all and heads in to meet Disa, his wife. There's also Gerda and Gamli, their 2 kids. It's all jovial jokes and slapstick again here, complete with belching for good measure. And it's at this point we cut back to see Galadriel, where she was off swimming. Well, it turns out she's been swimming with her knife all this time and thankfully managed to find a makeshift raft that takes her on board. God, what are the odds of that? Anyway, it turns out there's a worm out there in the water. Galadriel manages to survive the attack alongside a guy called Halbrand. On the makeshift remains of the raft, they sail to the mainland together. She keeps her distance from Halbrand though, eventually saying, "I'm wondering what manner of man would so readily abandon his companions to death." The irony here, of course, is that Galadriel was willing to do exactly the same thing at the start of episode 1, deciding to press on with her company and leave one of her own behind and let them die for her cause. Anyway, I digress. The pair butt heads over their ideologies, with Halbrand eventually telling her that evil is growing in the east, and the Southlands to be more precise. Back in the Southlands, Bronwyn finds herself in the presence of evil, in the form of a tribal masked orc that begins rummaging around. Theo and Bronwyn both attack it, with the latter throwing some sort of red mist at the orc. It's a brutal fight and Bronwyn is the one who hits the killing blow, decapitating its head and showing the men. As they prepare to head out, Theo happens to be holding what looks to be one of Sauron's trinkets. As he holds it, the item begins burning and a fire sparks up. Placing it in his bag, he heads out with Bronwyn and the others, who are on their way to the Elf Watchtower. As the episode closes out, Galadriel and Halbrand are saved by someone who looks like Celebrimbor in the shadows. Who could it be? Episode 3 of The Rings of Power begins with Arondir being brought before an Orc Legion. He's chained up along with a bunch of other prisoners and forced to dig. They also seem to be working on behalf of someone called Adar, which could well be an alias for Sauron. When the orcs slash Medhor's neck for questioning their way, arguing against chopping a tree down, Arondir instead steps up and volunteers to do it, not wanting any more bloodshed. Meanwhile, Galadriel wakes up on a ship alongside Halbrand. She takes a bowl of food from him and hungrily gulps down its contents. She's distrusting of those who have picked her up though, as a ship arrives at the Land of the Star, the Island King of Numenor. Thanks to some exposition from Galadriel, we learn about this island nation. As a reward for men standing with elves in the last Great War, which happened off screen during the prologue unfortunately, the Valar granted them this island. It's changed a lot since then, with Numenor breaking free from its roots and turning away elven ships. Halbrand and Galadriel show up at the council, where the latter demands a ship to head over to Middle-earth. The Queen Regent Miriel smirks as Galadriel promises she'll pass through no matter what, rudely claiming she has no need for her welcome. Just as things start getting heated, Halbrand suggests they give it a few days, 3 to be precise. But of course it's been a hot minute since we've got some exposition, so here's some more for us. We learn the captain who picked up Galadriel is called called Elendil. He was originally of a noble line, but now he's a sea guardsman with a son who is set to follow him into service, and that son happens to be Isildur, who we know goes on to take the ring. Elendil is an uncommon name, but it originates in the West, meaning one who loves the stars. It can also colloquially mean elf friend. However, the Queen Regent is not happy about him picking up Galadriel, warning that it could be treason. In order to quell that, he has to do her a service. Galadriel makes her way down to the dock, seriously contemplating stealing a boat from some innocent fishermen. This is our protagonist, by the way, the one we're supposed to root for. Elendil shows up and tries to stop her, and as a result, she takes out a knife and questions him, arrogantly proclaiming, "Who is the mortal who speaks to me as if he has the slightest idea who I am?" Anyway, when Elendil mentions the Hall of Law, the pair ride off together, prompting a cheesy scene of Galadriel smiling and riding a horse across the beach. I say smiling, I mean smiling's doing a lot of heavy lifting in this sentence. Anyway, I digress. Back in Numenor, Halbrand speaks in riddles and tricks, before showing how dominating he can be, taking out 4 men who attempt to attack him in the alleyway. There are blood spatters across the wall, but when the royal guard shows up, he's stopped in his tracks. In the Hall of Law, Galadriel learns that there's an account of a human spy, retrieved from an enemy dungeon and has drawn the mark of Sauron. And of course, it's also the outline for the map of the Southlands too. This speaks of a plan where a new realm will see evil rise up. If Sauron has indeed returned, the Southlands are but the beginning, Galadriel warns. Meanwhile, we get more drama with the Harfoots. They're about to migrate, but before they do, that strange wizard, Gandalf, shows up in town and says Nori's name. Nori wants to break free from the laws of the Harfoots, but despite what the laws say, that she can be decaravanned, the Brandyfoots are still allowed to continue on, but they need to be at the back of the group instead. Despite struggling to begin with, this wizard shows up and helps push their caravan. Over in Numenor, Elendil's daughter is accepted into the Builders Guild, while Galadriel visits Halbrand while he's behind bars. Apparently Halbrand is actually a king. As he approaches the bars, he tells Galadriel, "I'm not the hero you seek, for it was my family who lost the war." Galadriel is determined though and asks Halbrand to join her in their trip over to Middle-earth, so they can redeem both their bloodlines. As we come towards the end of the episode, we cut back to the Orc pits one more time, as Arondir and the others work together to try and break their chains. A game of tug and war ensues, leading to Arondir jumping high and breaking the flimsy roof. The Orcs bring out a single warg to try and stop them. Arondir defies the laws of gravity, seems to be a lot of that going around in this series, doesn't it? And takes it out single-handedly while also fending off the Orcs too. Unfortunately, it's all in vain as the Orcs decide to venture out into the sun after all and pull him back down into the pits, right off the back of seeing his elf friend take several arrows to the chest. Out from the shadows steps Adar, but the image is blurry, so it seems we'll have to wait until the next episode recap to find out who that is. Episode 4 of The Rings of Power starts with us at the Palace of Numenor. Queen Regent Miriel dreams of a massive flood washing over and destroying everything before awakening with a start. Out in the streets, Tamar gives a big speech to the people about the dangers of elves taking their jobs. Is this an allegory? You betcha. The same sort of allegory that Tolkien despised, by the way, which he wrote about in several letters. Most expensive TV show of all time. Would have been nice if they'd done a bit of history into that, wouldn't it? As the Númenóreans disdain at the idea of their queen being in collusion with elves, Pharazôn shows up and reassures them, reminding the group that this will remain a kingdom of men, not of elves. He also offers them a whole bunch of drinks to quell the mood. Galadriel returns to Miriel and points out that Halbrand is the lost heir in exile to the throne of the Southlands. Of course, Miriel doesn't believe her, but Galadriel is persistent, pointing out they should fight together to save the people of the Southlands before Sauron strikes. Miriel rejects this again until Galadriel decides to steamroll over the Queen Regent, pointing out she has a tempest in her and it brought her to Numenor. After threatening the Queen, Galadriel is predictably put behind bars. What the wonderful negotiation skills this wise elf actually has. Arondir is put into chains and meets Adar, who seems to be an elf with scars up his face. He points out Arondir has been told many lies and he wants the world to be changed, but only gods can do that. Adar doesn't answer Arondir when he asks what Adar actually is, but instead tells him to go to the men who have taken refuge in the old watchtower. He's to deliver a message, and with that, he's let go. Over in the Southlands, a whole bunch of people hold up in the guard tower. Bronwyn tries to ration the food, but while Theo believes they should go back to town and grab some supplies, Bronwyn thinks they should just hunt. So naturally, Theo doesn't listen and heads into town anyway, grabbing a cart and lots of supplies. Theo's friend, Rowan, gets spooked over the growing shadow of the clouds and decides to hightail it out of town. Unfortunately, he leaves Theo behind, who happens to be inside one of the houses. An orc shows up, prompting Theo to grab that strange sword hilt. It turns into a sword, and after fighting his way out, he hides in a well. Elrond returns to Celebrimbor, who reflects on how Elrond's father once said that his future would be in Elrond's hands. The next scene, Elrond is back at the mines. Just like that. How quickly did he make it to the mines? Durin claims he's mining quartz, but in reality he's digging in the old mine. Elrond happens to be listening from afar, realising they're referencing the old mine below Mirrormere. Elrond wanders off alone without a dwarven escort and finds a hidden door in the rock. Heading through, he runs into Durin, who makes him promise not to tell anyone what he's up to. It turns out Prince Durin has found a new ore, explaining what was in the mystery box several episodes back. It's Mithril. Durin believes this could be a new era for the dwarves, but he's acting in secrecy because his father has strict rules about mining too deeply. Now, Elrond mentions here that 20 years is far too long to stay away, referencing the same time that passed in episode 2. Anyway, there's a cave in, but thankfully all the dwarves are safe. As a consequence though, the mine is shut down and Durin is prevented from mining anymore. However, Durin has a really touching chat with his father as King Durin III patches up his issues with his son. Prince Durin eventually decides to go with Elrond to Lindon. Meanwhile, Galadriel paces in her cage as she reflects on her negotiation skills, or the lack thereof. Halbrand points out that Muriel's real anger stemmed from mention of her father, the king in the tower, whom no one has seen in years. That night, the Queen Regent makes a decision and chooses to ship her back to the elves under armed escort. This is good news, given this is exactly what Galadriel wanted when she decided to swim hundreds of thousands of miles in the open sea back to land. When the cell is opened, an unarmed, armourless Galadriel single-handedly bests 5 armoured men, pushing them all into the cell and locking them up. She looks over at Pharazôn and smirks before walking away. The army rallies to try and find Muriel's father, who happens to be in bed and badly ill. Galadriel apologises, believing there should be truth between them. Muriel decides to trust Galadriel after all and leads her to a lost Palantir. She touches it and experiences the same flood scene that Muriel dreamed of at the start of the episode. Muriel wants to send Galadriel away to prevent this future from coming to fruition. Theo's friend, Rowan, returns to the tower, but unfortunately Theo is still in the well. During the night, Theo tries to escape, but he runs right into the orcs. However, he's saved by Arondir, who was let go earlier in the episode by Adar. Despite it being the middle of the night, they head through the forest and the sun begins to rise, prompting the orcs to stop their pursuit. Back in Numenor though, Galadriel leaves without Halbrand, who's now free and no longer locked up. Muriel has second thoughts about sending Galadriel away though when she notices the petals of the white tree fall. While Galadriel's boat is sailing away, Muriel speaks to the council and decides to personally escort Galadriel back to Middle-earth. Episode 5 of Rings of Power starts the most expensive TV show ever created, with Nori speaking to the stranger about their migration. Nori points out there's plenty of dangers along the way, and we should remind viewers that if these little halflings get hurt or injured, they're going to be left behind. So I guess in a way, the Harfoots are the biggest danger of them all. Anyway, they continue on, singing a little song while they continue to cross the land. As they make it into the woods, the all-loving Harfoot Malva suggests that Sadok should have taken Nori and the others as wheels and left them behind. Malva continues on though and finds mushrooms. As she begins to pick them, guttural screaming from the depths of the woods brings out several creatures that begin hunting them. Thankfully, the stranger manages to use his power to knock them back and send them sprawling. Elsewhere, Adar learns that the tunnel has been completed. His subordinate is told to summon the legions. It is time, he's told. They plan to march on the guard tower, which is currently home to Bronwyn and the Southlanders. Bronwyn speaks to the people and admits that they need to stand and fight to show a symbol of their strength. Hands go up in support, but they're easily swayed by an old man suggesting they should run and take their chances elsewhere. Unfortunately, it splits their force in half. The old man and his group run into Adar, who's forced to kill one of his own to prove his honour and loyalty to Sauron. Anyway, the orcs eventually begin marching on the tower, leaving Bronwyn and the others to face a big challenge ahead. Over in Numenor, the Númenórean soldiers practice. Galadriel scoffs at their efforts, deciding to personally step up and show them how it's done, because of course she does. It's been a hot minute since we've had our episodic Galadriel is better than everyone moment, and here it is. She doesn't even break a sweat as she bests them all, and gets applause as well. Hey, remember when everyone was worried last episode about the elves taking their jobs, and now we have an elf training their army and taking the job of the commander for this army? Strange that they're all applauding that, isn't it? It's almost like they've forgotten. Anyway, one could argue, until the end of this episode that is, they're applauding Valandil, a soldier who manages to get close to besting Galadriel. As per the agreement made with Valandil prior to this, he's promoted. The tide may rise and drown a man, or fall and sweep him out to sea. Pharazôn says to his son just after, the trick of mastering the current is to know which way it will turn next. And of course, as we all know, there are only two, high tide and low tide. It's another example of dialogue that sounds whimsical and flowery when in truth it doesn't really mean very much. Out on the shore, Isildur decides to stow away on a boat, but Kemen shows up to sabotage the cargo and burn it. As the pair wrestle, the lantern drops and the load explodes. Thankfully, Isildur has enough time to grab Kemen and swim to shore before the entire thing explodes. High up in a tower, Galadriel and Pharazôn disagree over the best course of action going forward. For now, Miriel decides to wait until first light to make a decision as Galadriel frowns and scowls. She approaches Halbrand and apologises to him, but not really. As we know, Galadriel only ever does anything that benefits herself, and here she's doing this so she can have Halbrand's voice at the council and swing things in her favour for the expedition. Galadriel goes on to admit she can't stop her vengeance-fueled mission, going on to bemoan how her company mutinied against her because she led them into a death trap and was prepared to leave them to die up the mountain, and that her closest friend conspired to exile her. Halbrand apologises on behalf of everyone that's done wrong to Galadriel, as our girl boss urges him to return to the Southlands, so that's how he will honour his people. Meanwhile, Gil-galad and Elrond sit with Durin and the dwarves as they toast to the union of their races. After, Elrond keeps his promise to Durin and doesn't reveal what the dwarves have found deep in the mountains. The light of the Eldar is fading, and Celebrimbor is quick to point out, though, that the Mithril will save their race from diminishing. It would also mean severing the union he's just made with the dwarves. Elrond eventually comes clean to Durin, admitting the entire fate of the elves is in his hands. As the episode closes out, the council make their decision, off screen mind you, and everyone prepares to leave for Middle-earth. Everyone stands to attention for Galadriel as she enters the boat wearing her armour, who approaches Halbrand, and the pair join hands. Episode 6 of Rings of Power starts with Adar running his hand through the dirt as his army of orcs watch on. He tells them they're casting off their shackles and will be facing one more trial, and that comes from taking out the small force inside the guardhouse. Only when they arrive, the place is abandoned. Or is it? It turns out Arondir and a couple of others are lying in wait for an ambush. On his own, Arondir takes out the tower by cutting a single rope which was holding all the rocks in place. Okay then. Anyway, he locks all the orcs in and runs away, managing to take out a fair few in the process from the falling debris. Meanwhile, we cut to the 3 little ships out at sea sailing for Middle-earth. It's worth remembering how small these boats actually are, as that will be important later on. Up on deck, Isildur meets Galadriel, amazed that she can see landfall already and he can't. And then, when the camera zooms out, we can actually see, quite clearly, landmass on the horizon. Anyway, Elendil feeds back to Miriel that it will be several days before they make landmass and can then ride to the east. Speaking of which, over in the east, Arondir returns to the group and tells them all that their little village gives them an advantage. They set up numerous traps and give a rallying speech, preparing for the night to close in before the orcs attack, and then it arrives. The bootleg Battle of Helm's Deep, or the Battle of Helm's Cheap, maybe?
That's not funny!
The orcs continue on despite the fire and little traps the villagers have put in place. Arondir is ambushed from behind, despite the fact he should have excellent hearing and vision, given he's an elf. Eventually it holds Arondir up and chokes him out until our elf is saved by Bronwyn. The villagers manage to best all the orcs and they save the day, or do they? It turns out the orcs are actually quite smart, and the villagers realise with horror that they've been killing their own men and women this whole time. No wonder they were so easy to beat. The orcs chuckle evilly from above and begin firing arrows, taking out several villagers and striking Bronwyn too. Everyone flees inside the tavern as all the orcs come out of hiding and rush on their position. After taking out the arrow from Bronwyn's chest, which is absolutely oozing with blood, they cauterise the wound, which seems to do the trick as she regains consciousness and seems to be on the mend. Adar appears though and begins killing villagers left and right. Before Bronwyn can be killed, Theo suddenly speaks up and tells them where the sword hilt is, the hilt that Arondir was going to hide so no one can find it, and it's under their feet below a stone. He hands it over to the orcs, much to the horror of Arondir. Galadriel suddenly marches on their position with an impressive army and a litany of soldiers, all of which somehow held up on 3 ships. They ride into the small village where Adar hurries away with the sword hilt under his arm. Galadriel gives chase. Halbrand strategically flies in from the front with his own horse though, and manages to stop Adar from getting away. Just before killing him, Galadriel stops Halbrand and demands he be kept alive, telling him one cannot satisfy their thirst by drinking seawater. Galadriel contemplates bringing the orcs she's kept captive into the sunlight in order to torture them. The threat of this sees Adar speak up and admit that he killed Sauron himself. Galadriel doesn't believe him though, and instead decides to wipe out every single orc, but keep Adar alive in the process so he can see his own children die before his eyes. Adar turns and questions Galadriel's evil nature in one of the better moments from this season, and she almost slits his throat until she's stopped by Halbrand. This evil little madam soon leaves, but Adar knows what we've known since episode 2. Halbrand is probably Sauron. Before everyone, Bronwyn asks if Halbrand is the king. He looks around. Yes, he says softly. Great, that solves that then. And as the episode closes out, Theo realises that the sword hilt isn't actually in their position, it's been switched. Waldreg, that old man, is actually the one with it, and he drops the sword and causes chaos to ensue. A rumbling on the horizon sees all the orcs begin chanting "Are done." All those tunnels being built now serve a purpose, which happens to be funneling all the waters into the bowels of a volcano. As a result, it erupts and a pyroclastic cloud blasts out. The villagers all begin panicking and scrambling around, except Galadriel, who just steps up and confronts the fiery cloud. As it closes in on Galadriel and the villagers, prepared to destroy absolutely everything, the episode comes to a close. Episode 7 of Rings of Power starts with Galadriel and the others surviving a pyroclastic flow, with temperatures ranging between 200 degrees Celsius and 700 degrees Celsius. That's between 390 and 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. How?
Don't ask questions, just consume product and then get excited for next product.
A flaming horse gallops past while Galadriel finds Theo absolutely fine, while most of the structures in the village are still intact too. So with all the survivors together, they head off in search of salvation. Meanwhile, the Harfoots decide to get the stranger to try and fix what's happening to their world. When a tree falls on Nori, they're lucky she's not hurt, because as we know, the Harfoots will just leave their wounded behind. Anyway, the stranger's magic seems to have worked as the trees begin sprouting masses of food that they greedily harvest. However, the Harfoots aren't alone. They're being watched by that mysterious trio we saw last episode. They silently head off, but Nori decides to stop them. That's a bad move though, as the leader sets fire to their caravan and burns everything, food included. As a result, they decide to follow Nori, although Sardok is convinced this is a bad move. Elrond asks for access to the Mithril mines from King Durin III, offering up to furnish the city with game, grain and timber from the Elder Forest for the next 5 centuries. I mean, that's a long period of time, and with Elrond dropping to his knees, he pleads with the King of the Dwarves for help in this endeavour. Disa though is not happy and believes they should reopen the mines themselves and see if there's a safe way of mining mithril. When Durin slides a piece of mithril across the table, it ends up next to the infected leaf and seems to heal it. So Elrond and Prince Durin begin mining mithril together, and there's some lovely banter between them. Honestly, these two and Disa are the best parts of the entire show. When King Durin sees his son in the mines, the pair have a pretty fiery chat. These scenes end with that aforementioned leaf floating down the recesses of the mines, where it happens upon a mighty Balrog. Down in the Southlands, Galadriel decides they should rally to the land of the living, away from where the volcano has struck. The next scene, we cut to Elendil and the others, where we see hundreds of Southlanders and Númenóreans are absolutely fine, and not even burnt, heading through the trees. As Theo and Galadriel walk together, the former is convinced that her mother and Arondir are dead. What cannot be known hollows the mind, fill it not with guesswork, says Galadriel, who spent most of the first episode guessing Sauron's whereabouts and leading an expedition across the world on hunches and guesses alone. Anyway, they make it out of the Southlands, where Galadriel reveals that Celeborn, her husband, is dead. She said goodbye to him and he went off to war, but hold up, why didn't the commander of the northern armies go to war as well? We saw her collecting helmets like a Jenga game, so we know she was at one of the wars. Why didn't she spend all that time looking for a husband rather than Sauron? Anyway, after another repurposed scene, this time from Fellowship with Theo and Galadriel hiding from an orc rather than a ringwraith, they evade Adar and his orcs as they near. Anyway, they make it back and find both Arondir and Bronwyn, who are absolutely fine. Galadriel approaches Míriel, who's blind now, and there are ships waiting to take them back, while Míriel vows that Númenor will return, and when they do, they'll be ready. Bronwyn is also leaving too, heading off to an old Númenorian colony by the mouth of the Anduin. They call it Pelargir, and apparently there's fresh land and water there too. Galadriel meanwhile is heading off to the High King, while Halbrand is wounded, but otherwise fine. Over in the Southlands, Adar decides to change the name of the Southlands to Mordor. Episode 8 of Rings of Power begins its finale with the stranger waiting for the rain to stop before coming out of hiding, apple in hand. That strange trio of elves, led by an Eminem lookalike, claim to serve him, bowing and calling him Sauron. But of course that's not right, because we know Halbrand is actually Sauron, so it's another red herring. Anyway, the trio encourages him to use his powers, but the Harfoots are waiting in the wings. They make a conscious decision to save the stranger, which is pretty admirable given their code about leaving people alone to die on the road. Unfortunately, it's another trap, but just before Nori is hurt, the stranger stranger comes out and whips up a strong gust of wind, slamming them down. After some more repurposed scenes from Fellowship of the Ring, namely that of Saruman and Gandalf fighting with staffs, the stranger is knocked down. Their leader begins breathing fire around the trees while Nori speaks to the stranger, telling him she knows he's there to help. And just before the Harfoots are destroyed completely, the stranger puts out all the fire and begins spewing Gandalf-esque lines. And if you hadn't figured it out already, the trio whisper that he's the other one and Istar, which means wizard. So probably Gandalf as we predicted. The stranger uses his magic to turn the trio skeletal and seemingly gone forever. Whether they'll return in a different form like some sort of ring wraith is left up for debate. However, all is not well with the Harfoots. Sardok is being fatally injured and decides to sit and watch the sun come up, passing away in the process. Meanwhile, Elrond has consigned himself to failure and speaks to Celebrimbor, telling him they need to abandon these shores. Speak of the devil, Halbrand shows up with Galadriel, the former needing medical attention. Outside, Elrond apologises for his failures while Galadriel talks about her foolhardy decision to jump off and swim hundreds of thousands of miles in the sea. She prayed at the time it was the right decision and decides to do the same now, taking a leap of faith and swimming against the tide. Halbrand is all healed up and arrives in Celebrimbor's workshop, gushing over his tools and interested in his gemstones. At the same time, Isildur's sister is told by Miriel's father about the doom about to befall Numenor and tells her she needs to look upon it herself. So she does. She heads into the next room and pulls the cloth off a Palantir. Meanwhile, Celebrimbor, Elrond, Gil-galad and Galadriel discuss crafting a new kind of power, something that Halbrand initially suggested and convinced Celebrimbor to pursue. Instead, Gil-galad rejects the idea and tells him to leave. A power over flesh is what dissuades him, which are Halbrand's words. Galadriel picks up on this, but Celebrimbor shrugs them off like they're nothing. Galadriel is suspicious, believing there's more to Halbrand than she's been told. Galadriel eventually does confront Halbrand outside, having looked in the archives and realised there is no king of the Southlands. I mean, given she was in the archives looking for information literally half a season ago in episode 3, did she not think to look at this then? But in a show where people can apparently survive pyroclastic flows and the rules of science and nature don't actually apply, who cares, right? Most expensive TV show of all time. Anyway, Halbrand admits that he's had many names in the past, as yes, he's Sauron. I alone can see your light, Sauron says, going on to tempt Galadriel with power and suggesting they rule together and save Middle-earth. Galadriel refuses. When the visions end, Galadriel wakes up and finds herself in the presence of Elrond. She realises that Halbrand has fooled them all and rushes to Celebrimbor's workshop, suggesting they make 3 rings as that will balance everything out. On the sea, Miriel tries to make sense of her surroundings while struggling with her blindness. As they make it back to Numenor, the harbour is bustling with ships. Hey, it sure would have been nice to have that lot during their attack on Middle-earth, right? Anyway, with Sardok dead, the Harfoots decide to continue their migration, chanting that nobody walks alone. Unless you get injured, of course, in which case you will just be left behind. Anyway, Nori leaves the Harfoots to head off with the stranger, who throws out some Gandalf repurposed dialogue about following your nose. And as the episode closes out, the 3 rings are formed while Halbrand, aka Sauron, walks into Mordor. And that is where season 1 of Rings of Power comes to an end. So there we have it. That should pretty much get you up to scratch ready for Rings of Power Season 2 when it drops in August 2024. I know this is slightly different than the other full season recaps we've done before, mostly because of the way that we've thrown quite a lot of sarcastic retorts in this. It was more of a kind of experiment than anything else to see whether this style works, especially because some of you guys have said that you enjoy the humour, others have said you haven't, so I've tried combining both of these styles together with more sarcastic retorts, tiny little cutaways, but mostly the bulk of the episode intact. It really is difficult to cover Rings of Power without actually diving into how awful some of the writing is. The fact that this is the most expensive TV show ever created, and basic facts like how a pyroclastic flow works, the text change from the Southlands to Mordor, the characterization, or poor characterization I may say, for pretty much every character minus the dwarfs, and Elrond, who are the best part of this show, is awful. It's pretty laughable. And going back in and covering this one a second time after I've already gone in and watched it a first time, you really do pick up how much is wrong with this and how awful some of these scenes are. But again, do let us know whether this style is something you enjoy or whether you think we should go back to just doing the straight shooting full season recaps. Either way, your support is massively appreciated, and keep those comments coming. Do like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the content we do, and if you don't enjoy the content, then thank you for watching this far. I'm Greg Wheeler, and from all of us over here at The Review Geek, we'll see you on the next video.